RHMLWest gives a graphic description of the Portuguese Jew. For example, Barack Espinosa, middle-sized, good features, skin somewhat black, black curly hair, long eyebrows of the same color. So that one might know by his looks that he was descendant from a Portuguese Jew. When the Jews were expelled from Spain, about 100,000 entered Portugal. They were permitted to enter under the condition that they would pay the poll tax, with the understanding that they would leave the country within 8 months. Also, at this time, the king obligated himself to take the Jews wherever they desired at the termination of the 8 months. When the time expired, many Jews were stranded because the king did not provide enough ships in time. All the black Jews who were left behind were deprived of their freedom and sold into slavery. During the reign of King Jono II, or John II, 700 black Hebrew children were ruthlessly taken away from their parents in Portugal and transported to the island of St. Thomas off the west coast of Africa. This island is located near Nigeria, Cameroon, and Gabon. Alangabe says that the Portuguese founded the island of St. Thomas in 1471. In the year 1484, King John II of Portugal, who reigned from 1481 through 1495, offered the Jews of his kingdom the choice of baptism or settling at St. Thomas. The multitudes of Jews were sent to this island during the reign of King John II. These Jews, Judeos, as the Portuguese called them, are Syrians, reserved and wealthy, holding most of the trade in their hands. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish themselves on the West African coast. They came first as merchants and secondly as conquerors and slavers. Later in this work, the black Jews in the Portuguese possessions in West Africa will be discussed in greater detail. Now let us return to the Jews of North Africa. With the influx of tens of thousands of black Jews from Spain and Portugal seeking refuge in African ports, Morocco received a great share. But before this date, many Jewish tribes were entrenched in Fez, the Atlas, and the desert. In Morocco, there was a revival of Moorish and Jewish science in all areas. The Hebrew Academy in Fez competed with the one in Khartoum, Algeria. There are many debates and lectures between the sages and scholars of these schools. Eldad the Danite, a Hebrew from the Jewish kingdom of Ghana, visited these schools in the 9th century. There was a celebrated Hebrew college in Sijamasa in the desert, south of Fez. The school of Sijamasa produced many illustrious scholars. They were grammarians, masters of Talmudic law, poets, and philologists. This period of Jewish scholarship came to an end with fanatical Almohades, went on the warpath in 1145 and destroyed the city of Sijamasa. And this reign of terror was carried out against all non-Muslims. Concerning the destruction of Sijamasa, Ibn Ezra writes, I say, let there be mourning for the community of Sijamasa, city of the great scholars and sages. She sees her light covered with shadows. The pillars of the Talmuds were shattered. The temple of law was destroyed, and the Mishnah was trodden under the foot. There are many Jewish tribes and settlements throughout Morocco and the Sahara Desert. These are Ali Musa, or Ben Musa, sons of Moses, is one of the spectacular Jewish tribes. Leo Africanus, a Moorish converted Jew, states that the Jews of North Africa are of a hybrid quality. They have proselytized and intermarried among the Greeks, Vandals, Romans, Spaniards, and Portuguese. The Jews intermarried among the Greeks when the latter established their colony in Libya called Garanasia. Some intermarriages occurred between the Jews, Romans, and the Vandals when the latter two invaded North Africa. And before the Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal, there were some intermarriages. Considering all of this intermingling, many Jews of North Africa still retain much of their colored features. According to Maurice Fishberg, he was unable to distinguish a Jew from a Mohammedan while passing along the streets of Algiers, Constantine, and Tunis. It was remarkable that among the non-Jewish natives there are many Jews of Negroid type. Fishberg visited Africa during the early part of the 20th century, and he discovered that there are black Jews living in the multitude of the oases in the Sahara Desert. Nahum Slosh, the white Jewish rabbi, visited these Jews of North Africa and the Sahara during the turn of the century. Slosh obtained his information of these Jews from three sources: from the historical records of the Arabs, from the oral traditions of the inhabitants of the Sahara, and three, from archaeological evidence excavated from the ruins of old Jewish cities in the Sahara and the Sudan, which date from the 13th century. About halfway down the eastern border of Algeria, these are large settlements of black Jews at a place called Wargla, says Slouch. Jews were at Wargla as early as 620 AD, according to Gabe. Again, Gabe says in the Wargla oasis of Algeria, 350 miles from the Mediterranean, is a colony of Jews as black as Negroes. In the Garian section of Libya, not far from Wargla, there exists the troglodyte Jews. It is reported that the Jews fled to the stronghold of the Nifasan mountain range because of the Roman and Arab persecution. Gabe quotes H.H. Copper, who says that the Jews of the city of Tripoli asserted that they migrated from Garian, and these Jews constructed subterranean synagogues and underground houses. Slouch visited the stronghold of these troglodyte Jews in the early part of the century. The Jews had built compartments 3 and 4 stories underground, containing a population of 30,000. Gabe says that Hesse Wartage visited their cities of Bani Abbas, Jebel Nefusa, Yehud, Abbas Hydrenta, Jebel Enfrente, and said they had shops, stores, schools, and synagogues all underground. The achievement of these Jews proved what a persecuted society can do under adverse conditions. These Jews had a foundation to build on. Unlike other persecuted people, they had their history, their culture, their laws, their language, and skills. Between Wargla and the Gaharian, there is a Jewish town called Tigrina. Here the Jews have also constructed subterranean compartments. Nahum Slough says that he was guided to the ancient synagogue, which was located underground. At this time, he made an extensive observation of the village, which contained 20 underground courts and its 700 inhabitants. Also, he found there a young man teaching Hebrew. When Slough was in this city about 1 hour, the men had just returned from the market. Slough says they are all a fine, dark people. The rabbi was descended from Jews who had migrated to Morocco. The rabbi at this time informed Slough of the fact that there existed in the district many traces of deserted Jewish cities and cemeteries now abandoned. The Jews of this country have handed down the oral traditions that in ancient times they constituted the majority of the population, but the epidemic wars and frequent conversions to Islam have reduced their number. On one occasion, Slough met a Jewish itinerant merchant of Nifasa who had just arrived from Fezzan. This Jew had traveled all over the routes of the Sahara. He assured Slavs that other Jews existed, at least in the East Sudan, a black-skinned population which some call the Felici, and which are generally known among the Tuaregs as the Krit. They observe the Sabbath and are known to be of Jewish origin. Many of these tribes in the Sahara and the Sudan are Muslims in religion but are Hebrew in nationality. Nahum Slouch says numbers of these Islamicized Jews may be found everywhere. They are among the nomads of Nigeria, the Sunan, the Hanashana, the Traras, the Masmata, the Majuridan, the Kabalites, and the Twa. You find them among the Arasfana, the Gariani, the Brahmi, and in Tripoli. You will find them in southern Morocco among the powerful clans of the Dagatans, who control the routes of the Sudan and southward. They are non-Jewish by religion, but aware of their Hebrew origin. They are friendly to the Jewish merchants. Frequently, the Jew is the only communication between these tribes and the outside world. The Dagamdan Jews are scattered in clans through many caravan routes, oases of the Sahara and the Sudan. Gabe says the word Gagatan means traders, that they are located near Timbuktu and hundreds of miles northward. They are also found east of Timbuktu and Gayo. The two main factors that motivated the black Jews to penetrate into North Africa were commerce and persecution. Also, these two factors impelled them to migrate into Central Africa, which is known as the Sudan. The black Jews who migrated to the Sudan from the north converged with the Jews migrating from the eastern Sudan to the countries of the Niger River. It is a known fact that the Jews and Judaism were in Africa 1500 years before Islam, and that everywhere the Arabs went, the Jews were there. The black Jews guided the Arabs and Moors into Spain and acted as interpreters. When the Muslims came into Sahara, they found the black Jews stationed on all the trade routes, and I can positively say that they were Mohammedans, and is currently prevailing in the Sudan. Judaism once had been dominant. Much proof, and still much proof, more to be revealed by scholars, that there existed prior to the slave trade and subsequent to it many Jewish tribes, colonies, and kingdoms in West Africa. The Moorish writer Leo Africanus informs us of the past existence of a medieval Hebrew state called Camnuria. Its two main cities were Camnuri and Nakhira, and this state was located north of the Senegal River. According to this Moorish Jew, the black African Hebrew state, he vanished by his time. There are two given reasons for the ruin of his kingdom: the intensive sandstorms of the Sahara causing droughts and rendered the cities inhabitable, the migration of the Falas toward the west, the Kanuri called the Fulas Falata. These Fulas transmigrated the entire Sudan from the Nile to Senegal. The Kanuri Jews are now located in the central Sudan along trails hundreds of miles north, south, east, and west of Lake Chad, where they migrated from Senegal. It is the conclusion of some scholars that when the Jewish kingdoms of Ghana fell, many of the Hebrew tribes established settlements among the African tribes throughout Central and Western Africa. Thus, the Moorish writer Al-Edrisi of Andalusia, Spain, wrote in the early part of the 20th century about the powerful Hebrew colony of Lamlam. Lamlam was situated about 200 miles west of Timbuktu. The Hebrew merchants were then monopolizing the trade that was concentrated in Timbuktu. Lamlam was entirely Jewish, and she fought wars to maintain her control over trade. Edrisi also said that there were only 2 towns south of the Kingdom of Ghana and Cantonese. Edrisi said that there were only 2 towns south of the Kingdom of Ghana, and continues, according to what the people of his country report, the inhabitants are Jews. When they had reached the age of puberty, they were branded on the continents, or at least on the temple, with fire, leaving identifying marks. All the dwellings in their countries were built on the bank of a river which flowed into the Nile. Idrisi meant the Niger River. It was the belief of the time that the Niger formed the upper to reach up the Nile. The black African Hebrews had settled not only in the interior of Africa, but they also had communities on the west coast of Africa, from Morocco to Angola. In the year 1586, Dr. J. Wilson wrote his History of Western Africa. He transmits to us the composite religious culture of some of the inhabitants of Senegambia and Guinea. In Senegal, he said, there is a complete medley of paganism, Judaism, and Mohammedanism, and it is difficult to say which of these 3 occupies the most prominent place or exerts the greatest influence upon the charter of the people. However, the sentiment of the inhabitants regarding the multi-religious mixture was that the combination of the 3 religions furthered the welfare of all. How do we rationalize and explain the medley of paganism, Judaism, and Mohammedanism near the means of the medieval Jewish kingdom of Camnuria? It is obvious to the researchers that after the breakup of the Hebrew kingdoms of Ghana, Camnuria, and Lamlam, the black Jews migrated to remote regions of the interior and the coast. Then these Hebrews came under the pressure of Muslim propaganda and pagan influence, resulting in what is known as cultural diffusion. If you recall what Slouch said, many Jews became Muslims but still retained their Jewish origin. Wilson also informs us that in northern Guinea there is a conglomeration of Judaism and paganism combined in a southern Guinea. There is a combination of Judaism, paganism, and some traces of Christianity. In northern Guinea, or Portuguese Guinea, Judaism is more highly practiced. Some of these outstanding rites are purifications, the observance of the new moon, a designated period of the weeping for the dead, during which the time they wear sackcloths and ashes, bloody animal sacrifices, with the careful sprinkling of blood upon the doorposts and the altars, the divisions of the tribes into different families, frequently into 12 parts, formal processions, circumcision, and various other practices, probably of Hebrew derivation. A few of these rituals, especially circumcision, might have been derived from the Muslims, but we are forced to consider the entire congeries of the Hebrew cultural traits, which is indicative of the Hebrew religion. Wilson says although the natives of Africa retain these outward rites and ceremonies with the utmost tenacity, they have little or no knowledge of their origin or the particular object which they are intended to commemorate. Many of them are performed to shield themselves from some threatened evil or to secure some coveted good, but in the great majority of the cases they are attended merely as a matter of habit, and the only reason assigned for observing them is that their ancestors did the same before them. It stands to good reason that if their ancestors observed these Hebrew rites, they were surely Hebrews. It is written, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in their remembrance. Like the black Jews in America, some of these Jews of Guinea don't remember their original nationality. This deplorable ignorance is attributed to various causes: the fall of the Hebrew kingdoms, the lack of communication with Jewish educational centers, intense persecution, and the deliberation blotting out of the mind their true nationality. Thus, Nahum Slosh said this about the Islamized Jews he met. In most cases, these Hebrews by race and Muslims by faith seek to hide their origin, which has become a burden to them. In another example, the persecution of the black Jews in Portugal was so ruthless and frequent that Cecil Roth tells us that the Jews did not divulge to their children the secret of their religion until they had attained the age of reason. The Hebrew religion is such that if you deny your religion, you will eventually deny your nationality. The sociologists and psychologists know, and history has proven, that if you deny your culture and nationality over a long period of time, you will totally forget it through a process of assimilation. The black Jews came to Africa not only by land, but also by sea. As you recall, in the year 1484, King John of Portugal deported great numbers of black Jews to the African island of St. Thomas. The island of St. Thomas near Nigeria and the Cameroon was discovered by the Portuguese in 1471, and it was established as a penal colony. To this island, Jews were sent who would not accept baptism. It is obvious that the Jews were deported to St. Thomas not only to mete out punishment to them, but King John's ulterior motive was to establish a commercial base with sophisticated black Jews in his growing empire in Africa. As time elapsed, the black Jews in Portugal and the black Jews in Portuguese colonial possessions became known as Black Portuguese. They were called Black Portuguese because they were born in Portugal and they knew the history, culture, and language of Portugal. As it has been mentioned before, King John of Portugal furnished ships in order to deport these Jews to any country they desired. However, unscrupulous Portuguese captains exacted as much money as they could from the Jews and dumped their human cargo at various places along the West African coast. As a result, Alangabe writes that Winwood Reed met blacks in Guinea, West Africa, who called themselves Portuguese and claimed descent from the Portugal. Reed wrote in his book 1864, in another case, Daniel P. Mannix writes to us that Captain Cutler, a slave trader from Boston, was barbarously murdered with two of his sailors by a community of black Portuguese established near the mouth of the Sierra Leone River. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to trade on the West African coast and to establish colonies on a large scale. The Canary Islands were discovered by the Portuguese in 1341, ceded to Spain by Papal Bull in 1344. Senegal was discovered by the Portuguese in the 15th century, and the first settlements are believed to have been black Portuguese. The Gambia River mouth was discovered by the Portuguese in the 15th century. Sierra Leone first visited by the Portuguese in 1462. Guinea discovered the Portuguese in 1446. The island of St. Thomas discovered by Portuguese in 1471. The new inhabitants were black Jews deported here in 1484. Black Jews migrated to the Angola coast from St. Thomas between 1484 and 1499. The white Portuguese missionaries reached Angola by 1560, but white settlers did not establish a community until 1575. Let us return now to the Jews of St. Thomas Island. Scholars are uncertain concerning the exact number of Jews deported to this island, but it is certain that the number lies in the tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands. Continuous research is needed in African Hebrew history, especially in the excavation of ruined Hebrew cities in Africa. When this gigantic work is completed, I believe the evidence will reveal information that will amaze humanity. It is my sincere belief that a greater number of black Jews were deported to the western coast of Africa than is admitted by some writers. By the edict of King Manuel of Portugal in 1496, all Jews were to be out of Portugal by October 1497. However, considering this matter, he decided to Christianize the Jews. Fearing the loss of a valuable population, he wanted the continued use of their knowledge and services. He concluded that the only way the Jews could be tolerated in his country was to force them into the Christian faith. In March 1497, a command was proclaimed throughout Portugal for all Hebrew children between 4 and 14 years of age to be brought for baptism. All parents who did not bring their children voluntarily had their children taken away violently by the officials and forced into baptism. Cecil Roth writes, scenes of indescribable horror were witnessed as they were torn away by the royal bailiffs. The latter did not obey the instructions too closely, frequently seizing young people of both sexes up to the age of 20. In many cases, parents smothered their offspring in the farewell embrace. In others, they threw them into the wells in order to save them from the disgrace of apostasy, and then killed themselves. Sometimes even old men were dragged into the churches and forcibly baptized by overzealous fanatics. Horrendous conditions like these forced many Jews to escape secretly out of the country. These black Jews went to Portuguese colonial possessions in Western Africa. Remember that the Portuguese colonies in Western Africa were Guinea, St. Thomas, Senegal, Angola, and a few islands near the African coast. During the persecutions in Portugal, thousands of Jews left the country. The Jews were leaving the country in such large numbers that in 1499 and in 1531, the kings published a decree forbidding the new Christians, black Jews, from leaving Portugal without special permits. At this time, many Jews became Christians out of fear. Many of them were known as secret Jews, practicing Judaism in secret under the disguise of Christianity. Some of these writers call these Jews nominal Christians, Jews who are Christians in name only but practice Judaism in secret. In spite of all of these prejudices against the black Jews of Portugal, they excelled in all of the trades, skills, professions, and businesses. The wealth of the Jews was tremendous. Portugal is a small country about the size of the state of Florida. Nevertheless, in the year 1610, the Jews alone were worth 80 million ducats. The Jews dominated commerce and the export trade, so naturally the black Jew would engage in commerce and trade in many parts of Africa after they fled from Portugal. In the country called Gabon near the Congo, there were black Jews known as the Bavnambu. Some writers call them by various names such as Mabambo, Mayamba, Mayumba, and Mayamba. Proyard, a French writer, says that these Jews held the coast of between the Congo River and Rio Muni in Gabon. In 1776, their country began about 60 miles from the coast and extended north from the Congo about 200 miles. In appearance, these black Jews are hardly distinguishable from the other Africans. It has been reported that these Jews practiced some divination of magic like native Africans. However, they observed some Jewish ceremonies and lived in separate communities, not considering themselves native Africans. The villages of these Jews are situated along the Loango coast for more than 100 miles, even south of the Congo River. Gabe writes that when they are interrogated in regard to their origin, some of these Jews said that they migrated from the south, some from the north, some from the other side of the mountains, and like the Portuguese Jews, the Bambubu Jews were very active in commerce. When David Livingstone, was in Africa, he discovered a settlement of educated blacks about the year 1847. They were located inland about 200 miles from the Luanda coast and are known as the Jews of Angola.